Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, and welcome to the show this morning. The topic is today is capital punishment in Tennessee after the conviction, and we're fortunate to have with us this morning to talk about capital punishment and the period immediately after the conviction, Dr. Ann Charvet. Dr. Charvet is a sociologist as well as a death penalty advocate, as well as the person who is concerned with pardons in the state of Tennessee. And of course, Dr. Charvet, let me not only welcome you, but also to have you to give us some information about your background, your education, and in the meantime, you might be able to sort of straighten up some of the information that we gave in reference to your official kind of situation, how you see yourself in terms of dealing with capital punishment in Tennessee. That should be a part of your background kind of statement, and then we'll start talking about capital punishment after the conviction.
I first began working on death penalty cases about a week after I graduated with my doctorate, and I was asked by a defense attorney if I could interview some family members in Kentucky. And that was the first case I worked on, and for many, many years was described and defined as a mitigation specialist. Had never heard of that prior to becoming one. But our statute, and the statute of most death penalty, in most death penalty states, identifies that if you are seeking a death penalty, the jury should be entitled to weigh the mitigating factors against the aggravating factors. The state would present the aggravating factors, and the defense attorneys present the mitigating factors. And so early on, I had completed my degree about a week prior to starting this work. And I had studied family violence within the context of prevention and deterrence. And so equipped with a lot of information, and I think early on we thought that mitigation probably had to do primarily with family violence. And then later, as I explored mitigation on many, many cases, I came to understand that it's not simply family violence, it's community violence, it's violence in neighborhoods, in schools, in employment, on out to cultural issues of violence against people that seem to contribute to mitigation factors that statutorily are supposed to inform sentencing.
In other words, anything that that individual, any impact that society or the family or the community or baseball or whatever might have had on that individual's crime, that would be a factor that could be used in terms of dealing with mitigation. Is that what we're saying?
Well, and should be, so that we could understand the crime within the context that it occurred. There was a lot of difficulty early on in the cases that I worked in with pretty much being able to translate between attorney and client, and more importantly, I think, between family members who were victims of crime that were not identified and not served.
And so this is a sort of a murky area that you are now still in the process of trying to work things out, so that you could be fair to both the victim as well as the person who committed the crime. Would that be a fair characterization?
Well, and where I have taken it over the course of nearly 20 years is trying to place all of this information within the framework of restoring justice, recognizing the defendants and the victims, and primarily the family members of both, and seeking to answer the question. The question that I keep asking is, can a debt to society be paid? So much of my early work was with capital cases and with murders, and the product of the inquiry that I would do tended to address the question between life in prison or a death sentence. And what I had hoped over the years is to try to develop the same kind of science to the question of life in prison versus a potential release.
And so there, instead of hoping to keep an individual incarcerated forever, that there might be a possibility, even in a death case, that that individual might be eventually released from incarceration. Is that what we're saying? And of course, we're nearing our first commercial break, Dr. Charvet, and after we come back, we'll give you an opportunity to continue and perhaps elaborate on some of the things that you're saying. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is capital punishment in Tennessee after the conviction. And we have with us Dr. Ann Charvet, who is a sociologist and a person who has some information relative to what happens in capital defense cases and capital punishment cases after the individual has been convicted but not yet executed. And of course, Dr. Charvet, let's give you an opportunity to pick up at the point that we left off last time.
Well, I guess what's most important to me is that the theory that guides this work, social bonding theory, it's a theory that I utilized initially in my research to try to identify the elements of preventing and deterring domestic violence. And when I first began the work, the real issue around capital punishment became deterrence, or that's what one would hear a lot. And the harsher the punishment, according to this theory, is not the thing that deters crime. According to this theory, it's a stake in conformity that would deter crime. And those who have a stake tend to commit less criminal acts. And those with no stake in conformity tend to commit a lot of criminal acts and murders. And so primarily what I did initially on the way to trial was a study of the life course that identified elements of the social bond that would have deterred the crime or deterred the development of a criminal career. After the crime becomes another issue, because then you've got a long history of an individual living within a structured environment, and oftentimes a change in life, a change in all of the issues that led them to prison. So that's where this became a fascinating study for me, and it occurred to me that not only is this germane in terms of people facing death sentences, but it would also be significant in determining who was a good candidate for parole. And with the recidivism rate so irregular and high, I am convinced that there would be a way to study an individual
who has been incarcerated for a long period of time, and you could make some decision in terms of whether or not that individual ought to be given parole. I mean, would that be the outcome of such an activity?
If I were in a position to grant parole, there are questions I would want to have answered about that individual and about the social environment that I was returning that individual to live in, whether or not the debt had been paid, and whether or not that was the sentiment of the community that was about to receive the individual.
Now, but now, is it possible, and I think you introduced earlier off camera, what you call the governor's a formal paper that was written dealing with the governor of the state of Tennessee and parole and whatever. Why don't you explain that to our audience and as well as to myself this morning?
Guidelines for pardons, commutations, and reprieves. And essentially, we don't hear very much in Tennessee anymore about pardons. When I first came to Tennessee, there was a lot of information about pardons because there had been corruption and scandal. But it is statutorily identified that the governor, or actually it's the parole board's job to recommend, to make a non-binding recommendation to the governor. And so what I became interested in is how is it determined? and what factors are presented to the board, and whose responsibility is it to collect that information. I know that on a death penalty case, the responsibility is decided, and many services go to people who are facing death sentences that do not appear to be available to people who are, I call them terminal sentences, either a life without parole or a number of years that one couldn't possibly expect to live
to come out alive at the end of those years.
These are what I refer to as terminal sentences that essentially, in my opinion, lead to an increased danger within the prisons because they remove hope.
And not only that, they also keep incarcerated individuals who over a long period of time become ill and probably would be less an expense or less a burden on the state if they were somehow placed in another kind of setting outside of the being incarcerated. Would that be a fair assessment in terms of the age and criminal, death penalty population? Is that true?
I was informed yesterday that the cost of incarcerating an individual at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution is $65 a day, which is roughly $24,000 a year. Many of these individuals work, however, they don't receive realistic amounts of money, and I've always kind of viewed it that many of the people in prison actually work for their room and board and the rest of the facilities that they live in. But I think the point being is, if a study like this is going to be undertaken, where would the funding come from? So I started looking at the figures, and $24,000 a year is what it costs to keep an inmate incarcerated. And a mitigation or a clemency review would cost less than that. And if it saved taxpayers even 10 years, we would come out ahead.
And so you're only suggesting that there are some cases that you believe might be worthy of a review that are not capital punishment cases, but these individuals are there for life or without parole, and so that it might be less expensive on the part of the state to keep these individuals there. It might be better if perhaps they might be able to receive some kind of clemency or whatever kind of thing that perhaps the governor is in a position to offer through the parole board. Would that be
potentially, or perhaps legislatively we can address these issues. But what I'm saying is that we increase safety to not only the people within the prison by providing some kind of hope or a stake in conformity. We will increase safety to them, but also, and I think most importantly, to their children. 70% of which will follow their parent to prison.
And of course, let us, Dr. Charvet, take this second commercial break, after which we'll come by and give you an opportunity to continue that line of thought. And we'll be back with our audience following this very short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to this final segment of the show for today. Our guest is Dr. Ann Charvet, and the topic is capital punishment in Tennessee after the conviction. And of course, Dr. Charvet, I think you've given us some excellent information dealing with the theories of capital punishment in Tennessee after the conviction. Let's give you an opportunity to continue that line of thought, or to perhaps introduce more, some additional topics in it that our audience might be interested in.
I guess a big question that I have, that I believe at this point is not known and to my knowledge not been studied, is the impact of capital punishment on children and families. Not just the children and the families of the inmates or the children and the families of the victims of the crime. I think a lot of children are impacted in a manner at this point that we're simply not taking a look at. I have had for many years a 10-year-old child in my house. They keep changing. It's not the same 10-year-old child, but One of the things that I have watched is the understanding of what is execution and how kids are processing this information and what it means to them. I think my kids had exposure simply through my work that they might not have had otherwise, but I have great concern and primarily going back to the execution of Coe and how this was impacted or how this was experienced by my children and by the other children that I saw. One incident happened at my daughter's elementary school that I just can't take from my mind. Apparently, a man was reading the steps of lethal injection out of the newspaper to his wife, and their little boy went to school and explained to all the kids on the playground the various steps toward lethal injection. I think we're desensitizing kids. I think the media coverage is very problematic because we don't want to overexpose children, but we also don't want to commit executions without adequate coverage. And I'm concerned, might not be a happening, but I'm concerned that that might be
a real issue.
I think another real serious concern that I have, I call generational recidivism. Recidivism, when you're dealing with parole and probation, that's an important factor. But when we're dealing with the issue that 70% of the children of incarcerated parents are estimated that they will follow their parent to prison.
70%, 7 out of 10. Is that what we're saying?
That's what has been estimated at this point. In fact, George Bush allocated a large amount of money for those children. But I have problems with how exactly it's being spent. There are many, many people effectively parenting from within the prison. Then I think that is a much stronger deterrent than role models outside of the family. And many, many people, there are classes, parents in prison, that are being offered and that have been for a long time. But again, I mean, this generational recidivism is another issue, and I think these are unintended costs of the death penalty. And as a third issue, I think it's really important just to simply look at the expense. The death penalty allowed us to look at cases with a magnifying glass. But so many cases within the prison are being unexplored in this manner. And I think that's one of the largest concerns is the more money that the death penalty takes from our system, the less money is given to people who might be rehabilitatable and to families that might be reunited. I think the most important thing that could happen to a family of an incarcerated person is its reunion and the opportunity for a child to learn firsthand from their parent why they don't want to go there.
And so in a real sense, I think you mentioned, excuse me, earlier that money had already been provided for, I guess, children of incarcerated individuals who faced a death or a life imprisonment, but that money perhaps was not being effectively used or effectively spent now. Would that be?
Certainly, I don't want to express any disrespect for the people who are serving the needs of the children of the incarcerated, but I think that the efforts are inadequate, and I think that our understanding, one of the best things that I learned studying the death penalty for all this year is that the effects of trauma can be successfully treated. Domestic violence, school violence, violence within the prison, so much of this has to do with our understanding of post-traumatic stress. And one of the leading, her name is Dr. Lee Norton, has identified to me that treatments are successful. They don't look like psychotherapy, they are different. And because so many of us are suffering from post-traumatic stress sorts of symptoms, I think that's the key. I think that's where we should lead. Following 9/11, another one of my children skip school for the first time.
All right. Mm-hmm.
And because she is not a seasoned criminal, she of course confessed to her crime right off, that she did in fact leave the campus. And when asked why, she said incredulously, "Don't you people read the news?" She was terrified to be in she was not a criminal, but she didn't want to be in a public place and a public target 4 days after 9/11. And I do think we have a generation of children that would benefit greatly if we were to revise the whole system of clemency and the justice system in general with the principles of restorative justice.
Okay. Now, would that mean we would be more concerned about rehabilitation, perhaps, than punishment? Speak to that.
I do think.
You find that that's a major problem.
It's a major problem, and I do think it addresses the issue that we've got to teach our children to accept responsibility. When the consequences of accepting responsibility are too harsh, we've got to take responsibility for that system. And I think that if we were to allow people to take responsibility with and accept the consequences, I do think that's a very important part of it. Accept the consequences of what they've done. And obviously, if you're dealing with a murder, you can never bring back a life. But if you have murdered an income earner, you certainly can supplement that family's income if you can work in a normal setting.
And so that would be a method of perhaps taking responsibility for having removed that income earner from that particular family, and you would therefore be willing to compensate in a real sense for the loss of
I think
that
compensation is an appropriate manner. I think you have to repair any damage possible, whatever your crime. And the last thing you have to do is, I think that the most important way to honor a victim is to assist young people in not following your path.
Well, now that's something that we've got about a minute and a half, and let's have you to speak to young people in terms of their responsibility and for education and to stay out of violence and et cetera. Speak to that.
Keep in mind that I stated that according to social bonding theory, it's not fear of consequences that deters criminal behavior. Instead, it is having a stake in conformity. So although it may seem in some ways to be rewarding wrong behavior, in fact, if we provide the social supports and don't brand our children at such an early age. I mean, the fact that single mothers are losing their jobs because we made a mistake and released juvenile records, you know, we've got to repair that damage. We have to be, I think, the justice system has to be the leader in terms of showing young people how to accept responsibility for mistakes and how to correct them.
Very good. And of course, let me, over the last half minute that we have here, Dr. Charvet, thank you for bringing that information and, in a real sense, exploring with us some of the problems that individuals who have been incarcerated and perhaps might face the death penalty, some of the problems that they and their families face, as well as those individuals who might not be might not face the death penalty but have been incarcerated for the rest of their lives, and some of the problems that this has created for society as well.
It's the latter group for which I have the most concern.
And of course, we can appreciate that, and I'm sure that the information that you've given us is something that can open discussion in reference to such a topic. And of course, let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.